Rosa wiped the sweat from her forehead as she looked up at the towering glass building. 43 floors of pure luxury, and she was about to clean the penthouse at the very top. 3 years ago, when she first got this job, she never imagined she'd still be here. But life has a funny way of keeping you exactly where you need to be, even when you don't know it yet. The elevator ride to the top floor always made her stomach flip, not because of the height, but because of what waited for her up there. The Blackstone family lived in a world so different from hers that sometimes she felt like she was visiting another planet. Golden faucets, marble floors that cost more than most people's houses, and artwork that belonged in museums. Yet despite all this wealth, something always felt cold about the place. Richard Blackstone was the kind of man who could buy entire companies before lunch and forget about it by dinner. His tech empire had made him one of the richest people in the country. When Rosa first met him, she was amazed by how someone so powerful could seem so distant. He barely looked at her when she cleaned around him, treating her like she was invisible furniture. Sometimes she wondered if he even knew her name, even though she'd been working for his family for 3 years. His wife Victoria was different, but not in a good way. She noticed Rosa, all right, but only to point out things that weren't perfect. The way she spoke to Rosa always made her feel small, like she was bothering the family just by existing. Victoria spent most of her days planning charity events for rich people who wanted to feel good about themselves, or shopping for things she didn't need. Rosa had cleaned enough of her closets to know that some dresses still had price tags on them from months ago. But then there was Tommy, 12 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, but none of their coldness. The first time Rosa met him, he was sitting alone in his massive bedroom reading a book about space. Most kids his age would have been running around, making noise, getting into trouble. Instead, Tommy spent his afternoons quietly, like he was afraid of taking up too much space in his own home. Rosa remembered the day she realized how lonely he was. She was dusting his bookshelf when she noticed he had the same astronomy book checked out from the library 3 times in a row. When she asked him about it, his whole face lit up. Nobody had asked him about his interests in so long that he talked for 20 minutes straight about black holes and galaxies. From that day on, Rosa made sure to spend a few extra minutes in his room, not just cleaning but listening. Tommy was smart, really smart. He could solve math problems that would give most adults headaches, and he read books meant for kids much older than him. But whenever his father was around, Tommy seemed to shrink into himself. Rosa noticed how he would practice conversations in the mirror, preparing for the few minutes his dad might spend with him. Most of the time, those conversations never happened. Richard was always on important phone calls or rushing off to important meetings. The saddest part was watching Tommy try so hard to impress his parents. He would draw pictures of rockets and leave them on his father's desk, hoping for some kind of reaction. Rosa would find those drawings in the trash the next day, and it broke her heart every time. She started keeping some of them, telling Tommy they were too good to throw away. His smile when she said that was worth more than any paycheck. Victoria wasn't much better. She treated Tommy like an accessory that she could show off when it was convenient. Rosa watched her practice conversations with him before dinner parties, coaching him on what to say to make the family look good. But the moment the guests left, Victoria would go back to ignoring him, leaving Tommy to wonder what he'd done wrong. Rosa grew up in a small house with 7 brothers and sisters. They didn't have much money, but they had each other. Seeing Tommy with all the money in the world but none of the love she'd grown up with made her want to protect him somehow. She started bringing him homemade cookies, the kind her grandmother used to make. She would help him with homework, not because it was part of her job, but because he needed someone to care. What Rosa didn't know was that someone else had been watching Tommy too. David Blackstone, Richard's younger brother, visited the penthouse occasionally for business meetings. Unlike Richard, David always nodded politely at Rosa when he saw her. He seemed different from the rest of the family, warmer somehow. She noticed he would sometimes stop to talk to Tommy when he thought nobody was looking, asking about school or his latest book. But these conversations were always brief, and Rosa got the feeling that Richard didn't approve of them. Tommy would light up whenever Uncle David visited, but Rosa noticed that these visits became less frequent over time. Whenever she asked Tommy about his uncle, the boy would get a sad look on his face and say he wasn't sure why David didn't come around much anymore. It was like there was some invisible wall between the brothers that Tommy couldn't understand. The penthouse had everything a child could want: the latest video games, expensive toys, a room bigger than most apartments. But Rosa could see that what Tommy wanted most was something money couldn't buy. He wanted someone to notice him, to be proud of him, to love him for who he was instead of what he might become. He wanted to feel like he mattered to the people who were supposed to love him most. As Rosa finished her work each day, she would always check on Tommy one last time. Sometimes she would find him asleep at his desk, having fallen asleep doing homework that no one would check. She would gently wake him up and help him to bed, tucking him in like her own mother used to do for her. In those quiet moments, she would promise herself that she would keep watching over this lonely little boy, not knowing that soon she would become much more than just someone who cared about him. She would become his hero. But that part of the story was still waiting to unfold, hidden in the days ahead like a secret that would change everything. For now, Rosa was just a maid who noticed what others missed, that sometimes the richest children are the poorest of all, not because they lack money, but because they lack the one thing that money can never buy. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person who saves them comes from the most unexpected place of all. October 15th started like any other Thursday. Rosa arrived at the penthouse at 7 in the morning, just as she had for the past 3 years. The autumn rain was hitting the massive windows, creating rivers of water that blurred the city view below. She had her usual routine down to a science: start with the kitchen, work through the living areas, then finish with the bedrooms. But something felt different that day, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Tommy was homesick from school with a mild fever. Nothing serious, just enough to keep him from going to classes. Rosa found him in his room, wrapped in a blanket and reading another one of his space books. His cheeks were flushed, but he insisted he felt better. Victoria had left early for a spa appointment, barely checking on her son before rushing out. Richard was locked away in his home office, taking back-to-back video calls with investors in different time zones. "How are you feeling, sweetie?" Rosa asked as she straightened Tommy's room. She always called him sweetie, even though she knew Victoria disapproved. Some habits were worth keeping, regardless of what others thought. "Much better," Tommy said, though his voice was still a bit hoarse. "Rosa, do you think my dad will have time to watch a movie with me tonight?" He said maybe, but he always says maybe. Rosa's heart squeezed. She had heard Richard make that same empty promise dozens of times. "We'll see, honey. Why don't you rest a bit more? I'll bring you some soup later." The day dragged on with its usual rhythm. Rosa cleaned each room with the careful attention that had kept her employed here for so long. She could hear Richard's voice echoing from his office, discussing profit margins and market strategies. The rain kept falling, turning the world outside into a gray blur. By 6 o'clock, Rosa was finishing up her final tasks. Victoria had called to say she was having dinner with friends and wouldn't be home until late. Richard was still on his calls. Tommy had been feeling better as the day went on and had asked if he could go swimming in the family's indoor pool. Rosa hesitated. The boy was still getting over being sick and no one else was around to supervise. But Tommy was a decent swimmer and the pool area was safe, with non-slip surfaces and clear water. After making him promise to be careful, she agreed he could swim for 30 minutes while she finished cleaning the nearby areas. The pool was Richard's pride and joy, a massive indoor space with windows overlooking the city. The water was always perfectly heated, and the automatic cover system was top-of-the-line technology that could open and close at the touch of a button. Tommy loved swimming there, especially when it was raining outside. He said it made him feel like he was in his own private world. Rosa was in the adjacent laundry room, folding towels and listening to the gentle sound of Tommy swimming. She could hear him humming to himself, something he did when he was content. The sound made her smile. At least one person in this house knew how to be happy, even if it was just a 12-year-old boy who had learned to find joy in small moments. That's when she heard the first scream. It was sharp, terrified, and completely unlike anything she had ever heard from Tommy before. Rosa dropped the towel she was holding and ran toward the pool area, her heart already racing. The second scream was worse, desperate and muffled like it was coming from underwater. When Rosa burst through the pool area doors, the scene that greeted her was her worst nightmare. The automatic pool cover was halfway closed, creating a deadly trap across the water. Tommy was underneath it, struggling against the heavy material that was designed to support the weight of snow. but was now imprisoning a panicking child. She could see his hands pressing up against the cover from below, and occasionally his face would break the surface in the small space that remained open. Later, Rosa would learn what had happened. Tommy had been swimming near the edge when he accidentally hit the pool cover button with his elbow. The cover had started closing automatically, and in his sick, slightly weakened state, he hadn't been able to swim away fast enough. The more he struggled, the more he had become tangled in the cover's edges. The pool's safety systems hadn't detected him because he was under the cover, not in open water. But in that moment, Rosa didn't think about how it happened. She only knew that Tommy was drowning, and she was the only one who could save him. Rosa had never been a strong swimmer. Growing up poor meant no swimming lessons, no time at country clubs with pools. She had worked as a lifeguard for one summer in her 20s, but that was at a community pool where the biggest emergency was usually a scraped knee or a bee sting. This was different. This was life and death, and every second mattered. Without thinking about her uniform, her shoes, or anything else, Rosa dove into the pool. The water was shockingly warm after the cool air, but she barely noticed. She swam toward the area where she had last seen Tommy's hands pushing against the cover. The pool cover was heavier than she had expected, and the water underneath it was dark and confusing. She took a deep breath and dove under the cover. The world became a nightmare of blue water and white material pressing down from above. She felt around desperately until her hand touched Tommy's arm. He was conscious but barely, his movements weak and uncoordinated. Rosa grabbed him and tried to swim toward the open part of the pool, but the cover seemed to stretch on forever. Her lungs were burning when she finally found the edge of the cover and pulled Tommy to the surface. But he wasn't breathing. His lips were blue and his eyes were closed. Rosa had never been more terrified in her life, but her lifeguard training from years ago kicked in. She dragged Tommy to the pool's edge and somehow managed to pull his limp body out of the water. On the pool deck, Rosa tilted Tommy's head back and checked his airway. Then she began CPR, pressing on his small chest and breathing into his lungs, counting compressions the way she had been taught so long ago. "Come on, Tommy," she whispered between breaths. "Come on, sweetie. Stay with me." She had no idea how long she worked on him. It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then suddenly Tommy coughed, water spilling from his mouth as his body fought to clear his lungs. His eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened, but alive. "Rosa?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. You're okay. You're going to be okay." Rosa was crying and didn't even realize it. She held Tommy against her, both of them soaking wet and shivering, but alive. Richard found them like that 10 minutes later when he finally came looking for his son. The ambulance arrived shortly after, and the paramedics confirmed what Rosa already knew. She had saved Tommy's life. Another few minutes underwater, and the outcome would have been very different. At the hospital, doctors treated Tommy for near drowning and kept him overnight for observation. Rosa stayed in the waiting room, still in her wet clothes, until she knew he was safe. Richard and Victoria arrived separately, both looking shaken but also concerned about other things: privacy, potential lawsuits, keeping the incident out of the news. But as Rosa sat in that hospital waiting room, watching Tommy's parents worry more about their reputation than their son's trauma, she didn't yet know that someone else had heard about the accident, someone who would change everything for Tommy, and for her too. Someone who had been waiting for a chance to be the uncle that Tommy needed, and who was about to step out of the shadows. The knock on Rosa's apartment door came 3 days after the accident. She wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare in her small building on the outskirts of the city. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see David Blackstone standing in the hallway, looking nothing like the polished businessman she had seen in passing at the penthouse. He wore jeans and a simple sweater, and his face showed the kind of genuine concern that had been missing from his brother's expression at the hospital. "Rosa, right?" he said gently. "I'm David, Richard's brother. I was wondering if we could talk." Rosa hesitated. In 3 years of working for the Blackstone family, she had never had a real conversation with David. She knew he was Richard's business partner and that he visited the penthouse occasionally, but he had always seemed like someone from the background of their world. Now here he was, standing at her door like a regular person, asking to talk to her. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was tiny compared to any single room in the penthouse, but it was clean and warm, filled with photos of her family and small decorations that made it feel like home. David looked around with what seemed like genuine interest, not judgment. "I wanted to thank you," he said as they sat at her small kitchen table, "for saving Tommy. I heard what happened from the hospital staff, not from Richard. If you hadn't been there—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Anyone would have done the same thing," Rosa said quietly. "No." David shook his head. "Most people would have panicked or called for help or wasted precious time. You jumped in and saved his life. That takes a special kind of person." He paused, studying her face. "I also wanted to ask you about Tommy. How is he, really? I mean, beyond what the doctor said." Rosa was surprised by the question. She had expected thanks, maybe even a reward, but not this kind of personal concern. "He's scared," she said honestly. "Not just about the accident, but about everything. He thinks his parents are angry at him for what happened." David's expression darkened. "Are they? Victoria is upset about the mess, the drama, the attention it brought. Richard is worried about lawsuits and bad publicity. Neither of them has really talked to Tommy about how he's feeling." Rosa stopped, realizing she might be saying too much. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't be telling you family business." "You should," David said firmly. "Because I care about that boy more than you know, and I need to understand what's really going on in that house." He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. "Rosa, I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. I've been worried about Tommy for years. I see him maybe once a month when I come for business meetings, and every time he looks a little more lost, a little more alone." Rosa nodded. She had seen the same thing, watching Tommy shrink a little more each month as his parents became increasingly distant. "He talks about you sometimes," she said. "He always seems happy when you visit, but sad that you don't come more often." David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Richard and I don't get along very well," he finally said. "We work together because we built the company together, but personally, let's just say my brother thinks I'm too soft, too emotional. He especially doesn't like it when I show interest in Tommy. He thinks I'm interfering." "But Tommy is your nephew," Rosa said, confused. "Exactly. But Richard has always been jealous of how kids respond to me. Even when we were growing up, I was the one other kids wanted to be around. Richard was always the serious one, the one focused on success and money. He can't understand why Tommy doesn't automatically respect him the way employees do." Rosa was beginning to understand. "So he keeps you away from Tommy?" "He limits my access, yes. I'm allowed to see him during family functions and business visits, but Richard has made it clear that I'm not to get too involved in Tommy's life. He says it confuses the boy having too many authority figures." David's voice was bitter, as if Tommy has too many people caring about him. This explained so much that Rosa had observed over the years. The way Tommy's face would light up when David arrived, then fall when the visit was brief. The way David would look longingly at Tommy during family dinners, clearly wanting to engage more but holding himself back. The tension between the brothers that Rosa had always sensed but never understood. "What can I do?" Rosa asked. She had learned to trust her instincts about people, and everything about David felt genuine. "I see Tommy every day. I know how lonely he is." David looked at her with gratitude and something that might have been relief. Would you let me know how he's doing? I know it's a lot to ask, and I don't want to put you in an awkward position with Richard, but I care about Tommy, and I feel helpless watching him from a distance." Rosa thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. "I'll let you know how he is." David reached into his pocket and pulled out a card with his personal phone number written on it. "Text me, call me, whatever you're comfortable with. And Rosa, if Tommy ever needs anything at all, please let me know. I may not be able to be the uncle I want to be officially, but maybe I can help in other ways." Over the next few weeks, Rosa found herself texting David more often than she had expected. At first, it was just basic updates. Tommy was sleeping badly after the accident, having nightmares about drowning. Tommy had drawn a picture of the rescue and wanted to give it to someone who would keep it. Tommy had asked again why Uncle David didn't visit more often, but gradually the texts became more detailed, and David's responses showed Rosa just how much he had been paying attention to his nephew's life, from afar. When Rosa mentioned that Tommy was struggling with a science project, David texted back detailed questions about what kind of help the boy needed. When she said Tommy was sad about missing a school field trip because his parents forgot to sign the permission slip, David asked for the details and somehow arranged for Tommy to attend a private planetarium show. Instead, it was during one of these conversations that Rosa began to realize something that would change everything. David wasn't just a caring uncle who was being kept at arm's length. He was a man who had been actively trying to be part of Tommy's life for years, only to be blocked at every turn by his own brother. And more than that, he was someone who understood Tommy in a way that Richard and Victoria never had. "He's not like other kids his age," David said one evening when Rosa called him about Tommy's latest report card, all A's but with teacher comments about the boy being too quiet and seeming sad. "He's an old soul, that kid. He thinks about things most adults don't even consider. Richard sees that as a problem to be fixed, but it's actually Tommy's greatest strength." "You really get him," Rosa said, and she meant it. "I see myself in him," David replied quietly. "I was the same way as a kid. Too sensitive for my father's liking, too thoughtful for my own good. The difference is I had my grandmother who understood me. Tommy has, well, he has you now, I guess." That conversation planted a seed in Rosa's mind. Tommy needed someone who understood him, someone who could give him the emotional support his parents couldn't provide. David needed a way to be part of Tommy's life despite his brother's interference, and Rosa was in a position to help both of them, if she was brave enough to try. She just didn't realize yet how much courage it would take, or how many secrets she would need to uncover first. But late at night, as she thought about the lonely boy in his enormous bedroom and the uncle who loved him from a distance, Rosa began to form a plan that would either bring a family together or tear it apart completely. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard, especially when a child's happiness hangs in the balance. Rosa started noticing things differently after her conversation with David. Little details that had seemed like coincidences before suddenly took on new meaning. It began with the art supplies that appeared in Tommy's room 2 weeks after the pool accident. She was cleaning his desk when she found the expensive set of professional colored pencils and sketch pads still in their packaging. "Where did these come from, sweetie?" she asked Tommy, who was sitting on his bed reading. "Mom said they were an early birthday present," he said, but he looked confused. "She said she noticed how much I like to draw, but I don't think she's ever seen my drawings." Rosa knew Victoria well enough to know that was true. Tommy's mother barely glanced at his schoolwork, let alone his artwork. These supplies were expensive too, the kind that serious artists used, not something Victoria would randomly pick up. Rosa took a photo of the art supplies and texted it to David that evening with a simple question. "Do you know anything about these?" His response came back immediately. "Tommy mentioned wanting to improve his drawing skills during my last visit. I thought he should have proper supplies. How did you get them to him without Richard knowing?" "I have my ways. The delivery company thinks they're from his parents." That was the beginning of Rosa's education about David's secret involvement in Tommy's life. Over the next month, she discovered a pattern that had been invisible to her before. Every time Tommy mentioned wanting something or needing something, it would mysteriously appear a few days later, always presented as a gift from his parents or a surprise from the school. The telescope that appeared in Tommy's room after he talked about wanting to see Saturn's rings. David had arranged for it to be delivered when Richard was out of town, with a note saying it was from the astronomy club at school. The tickets to the science museum that Tommy treasured, thinking his parents had finally paid attention to his interests. David had bought them and convinced the family's personal assistant to give them to Tommy as a random surprise. But the most shocking discovery came when Rosa was cleaning Richard's home office. She was emptying the trash when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. There, crumpled at the bottom of the wastebasket, was an envelope addressed to Tommy in handwriting she didn't recognize. Something made her smooth it out and look at it more carefully. The return address said Uncle David. Rosa looked around the empty office, her heart racing. Richard was at work, Victoria was at her book club, and Tommy was at school. She shouldn't be looking through her employer's trash, but something about that discarded envelope bothered her deeply. If David had sent Tommy a letter, why was it in Richard's garbage instead of Tommy's hands? That evening, Rosa called David. "Did you send Tommy a letter recently?" There was a long pause. "I send Tommy letters every month," David said quietly. "I have for 3 years. Why?" "What do you mean, every month?" Tommy never gets letters from you. Another pause, longer this time. Rosa, are you telling me that Tommy hasn't received any of my letters? I found one in Richard's trash today, unopened. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When David finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. That explains a lot. Rosa, I need to ask you something. And I know it's not fair to put you in this position, but would you be willing to look for more letters? If Richard has been intercepting my mail to Tommy, there might be others. Rosa knew she was crossing a line, but thinking about Tommy's face when he talked about wishing his uncle would write to him made the decision easy. I'll look. What she found over the next week made her furious. Hidden in a locked drawer in Richard's desk, she discovered a box containing dozens of letters, birthday cards, and small gifts, all addressed to Tommy from his Uncle David. Some were recent, others went back years. Rosa carefully photographed everything and sent the pictures to David. The letters told a story that broke Rosa's heart. They were filled with love, encouragement, and genuine interest in Tommy's life. David wrote about being proud of Tommy's grades, excited about his love of science, and hopeful about spending more time together. He shared stories about his own childhood, gave advice about dealing with bullies at school, and consistently reinforced how special and valuable Tommy was. In one letter, David had written, "Your dad told me you won the science fair at school. I wanted to call and congratulate you, but he said you were too busy with other activities. I'm so proud of you, Tommy. I hope someday I can see one of your projects in person. You have such a curious mind, just like I did when I was your age." Another letter, from Tommy's 11th birthday, said, "I know we didn't get to celebrate together this year, but I want you to know that I think about you every day. I bought you a book about space exploration that I thought you might enjoy. I hope your parents will give it to you soon. Happy birthday, kiddo. Uncle David." Rosa realized that Tommy had never received that book or any of the other gifts David had sent. Richard had been systematically intercepting everything, creating a wall between uncle and nephew that Tommy didn't even know existed. But the most devastating discovery was a letter dated just 6 months ago. "Tommy, I heard from your dad that you don't want to see me anymore, that you think I'm too busy to care about you. That breaks my heart because nothing could be further from the truth. If that's really how you feel, I'll respect your wishes, but I want you to know that I love you and I'm always here if you need me." Rosa stared at that letter for a long time, anger building in her chest. Richard had not only been hiding David's attempts to connect with Tommy, but he had actively lied to David about Tommy's feelings. He was using his own son as a weapon against his brother, and Tommy was the one paying the price. When she called David to tell him what she had found, he was quiet for so long that she thought the call had been disconnected. "David, are you there?" "I'm here." His voice was thick with emotion. "Rosa, I need you to know that I never stopped trying to be part of Tommy's life. Every month I would ask Richard about Tommy, and every month he would have a new excuse for why I couldn't see him or talk to him. Tommy was busy. Tommy was going through a phase. Tommy was focused on school. I started to think that maybe I was the problem, that maybe Tommy really didn't want me around. He asks about you all the time," Rosa said. "He doesn't understand why you stopped visiting as much. He thinks he did something wrong." The sound David made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "My own brother convinced me that his son didn't want me in his life, and convinced his son that I didn't care about him. And we both believed it because we trusted him." Rosa could hear the pain in David's voice, and she made a decision that would change everything. "David, I think Tommy needs to know the truth. Not everything at once, but he needs to know that you've been thinking about him, that you care about him." "How? Richard will never allow it, and if he finds out you've been helping me, you could lose your job." "Let me worry about that," Rosa said. "Tommy deserves to know that someone in his family actually loves him, and you deserve to have a relationship with your nephew." That night, Rosa sat at her kitchen table and wrote out a plan. It was risky, maybe even dangerous for her job security, but she couldn't keep watching Tommy believe he was unloved when the truth was so different. She thought about the little boy who had almost drowned, who spent his days trying to earn his father's attention, who had no idea that his uncle had been fighting to be part of his life for years. Tomorrow, she would begin undoing 3 years of lies and manipulation. She would start giving Tommy the love and connection he had been denied, even if it meant challenging one of the most powerful men in the city. But Rosa had learned something important about herself the day she jumped into that pool. When someone you care about is in danger, you don't think about the risks. You just act. And Tommy had been drowning in loneliness far longer than he had been drowning in water. Tommy's 13th birthday party was everything a wealthy child's celebration was supposed to be, and nothing that Tommy actually wanted. The penthouse was filled with business associates, society friends, and people who knew Richard and Victoria, but had never spoken to their son. A professional party planner had transformed the space with expensive decorations. Hired staff served gourmet food that most of the adults barely touched, and a photographer captured every moment for the family's social media presence. Rosa watched from the edges of the party, officially there to help coordinate with the catering staff, but really there because she couldn't bear to leave Tommy alone in this crowd of strangers. The birthday boy sat at the head of an enormous table, wearing a suit that made him look like a miniature businessman, smiling politely as adults he didn't know wished him happy birthday, and immediately turned back to their conversations about stocks and real estate. David had arrived an hour into the party, and Rosa could see the tension in his shoulders as he surveyed the scene. Victoria had invited him, though Rosa suspected it was more about appearances than genuine inclusion. Richard barely acknowledged his brother's presence, too busy networking with potential investors who had come under the guise of celebrating his son. "This is ridiculous," David said quietly as he approached Rosa near the kitchen entrance. "Look at him. He looks miserable." Rosa followed his gaze to Tommy, who was politely listening to a woman in expensive jewelry tell him about her grandson's achievements at private school. Tommy's eyes were glazed over with boredom and loneliness, even surrounded by all these people. "It gets worse every year," Rosa whispered back. Last year's party had a magician that performed for the adults while Tommy watched from the corner. David shook his head in disgust. He should be having a sleepover with friends or going to a movie or doing something that actual 13-year-olds enjoy. Instead, he's being used as a prop in his father's networking event. Rosa had been carrying David's most recent letter in her pocket for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. She had read it so many times she almost had it memorized. It was different from the others she had seen, more urgent, more honest about David's frustration with being kept away from Tommy. As she watched the boy suffer through another conversation with another stranger, she made her decision. "David," she said quietly, "I need to give you something, and I think today might be the day to give it back to its intended recipient." She handed him the letter, and David's eyes widened as he recognized his own handwriting. "How did you—" "It was in your brother's desk, along with dozens of others. David, Tommy has never received any of your letters." "Not one." The color drained from David's face. "What do you mean?" "Richard has been intercepting them for years. Tommy doesn't know you've been trying to reach him. He thinks you lost interest in him as he got older." David stared at the letter in his hands, then looked across the room at Tommy, who was now opening presents with the mechanical enthusiasm of a child who had learned not to expect anything meaningful. "That explains everything," he said quietly. "Every time I asked Richard about Tommy, he said the boy was busy or going through a phase where he didn't want to see me much. I thought maybe I had done something wrong." "You need to tell him," Rosa said urgently. "Today. Look at him, David. He's drowning again, just not in water this time." Before David could respond, Richard's voice boomed across the room. "Time for the birthday boy to open his presents." The adults gathered around as Tommy was presented with a pile of expensively wrapped gifts. Rosa and David watched as he unwrapped each one with polite thanks. The latest gaming system he had never asked for. Designer clothes he would never wear. Gadgets chosen by personal assistants who had never met him. "This is from your Uncle David," Victoria announced, handing Tommy a small wrapped box that David clearly hadn't brought. David looked confused as Tommy opened it to reveal an expensive watch, adult and impersonal. "I didn't buy that," David murmured to Rosa. "They probably had their assistant pick something," Rosa whispered back. "They've been doing that for years, buying gifts in your name." As Tommy held up the watch with fake enthusiasm, thanking his uncle for something his uncle had never chosen, David's expression hardened with determination. "This has to stop," he said. "Right now." Before Rosa could stop him, David was walking across the room toward Tommy. The conversations quieted as he approached the birthday boy, and Richard looked up with an expression of mild annoyance. "Tommy," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I need to give you your real birthday present. David." Richard's voice had a warning tone. "This isn't the time. Actually, it's exactly the time." David reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter Rosa had given him, along with several others he had apparently brought with him. "Tommy, these are letters I've been writing to you every month for the past 3 years. Letters you never received because your father has been keeping them from you." The room went completely silent. Victoria's face went white, and Richard stepped forward with barely contained anger. "David, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm telling my nephew the truth," David said, never taking his eyes off Tommy's confused face. "Tommy, I need you to know that I have never stopped caring about you. I have never been too busy for you. I have written to you, called about you, asked to see you, and been told repeatedly that you didn't want to have anything to do with me." Tommy looked between his uncle and his father, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. I never got any letters. Dad said you were too busy with work to visit much anymore." "I was never too busy for you," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "I brought you a telescope for your 10th birthday that you never received. I sent you books about space, art supplies, birthday cards, Christmas presents. All of it was kept from you." Rosa watched Richard's face cycle through anger, panic, and calculation. She could see him trying to figure out how to control this situation, how to minimize the damage. But it was too late. The truth was out, and everyone in the room could see it written on Tommy's face as the pieces fell into place. "Is that true, Dad?" Tommy asked, his voice small but clear in the silent room. Richard tried to salvage the situation. "Son, your uncle has always been unreliable. I was protecting you from disappointment. By lying to both of us?" David's anger was finally showing. "By making your son think he was unloved and making me think he didn't want me around? How is that protection, Richard?" Tommy stood up from his chair, the expensive watch still in his hand. "You wrote me letters?" David knelt down to Tommy's eye level, ignoring the room full of witnesses. "Every month. I told you how proud I was of your grades, how much I loved hearing about your science projects, how sorry I was that we couldn't spend more time together. I told you stories about when your dad and I were kids and how much you remind me of myself at your age." Tears started rolling down Tommy's cheeks. "I thought you didn't care about me anymore. I thought I was boring." "You are the most interesting person I know," David said firmly. "You're smart and kind and thoughtful, and I have been fighting to be part of your life since the day you were born." The emotional dam that had been building in Tommy for years finally burst. He launched himself into David's arms, sobbing against his uncle's shoulder while David held him tight. Around them, the party guests watched in uncomfortable silence, finally understanding that they were witnessing something much more important than a birthday celebration. Richard tried one more time to control the narrative. "This is completely inappropriate. David, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "No." The voice was quiet but firm, and everyone turned to look at Tommy, who was still in David's arms but facing his father. "No, Dad, Uncle David stays. For once in my life, someone who actually cares about me is here, and I want him to stay." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Victoria, perhaps seeing which way the wind was blowing, surprised everyone by taking Tommy's side. "Richard," she said quietly, "this has gone too far. The boy deserves to know his uncle." Within an hour, the party guests had been politely asked to leave, and the family was sitting around the kitchen table with a lawyer on speakerphone, working out the details of David's official visitation rights. Richard, faced with the choice between a public family scandal and giving his brother access to Tommy, chose to negotiate rather than fight. Rosa watched from the background as the family she had served for 3 years was fundamentally transformed in the space of one afternoon. Tommy sat between his uncle and his mother, looking happier than she had ever seen him. David held his nephew's hand while he talked to the lawyer, making up for 3 years of stolen time. "Rosa," Tommy called out suddenly, looking around the room until he spotted her. "Rosa, come here, please." She approached hesitantly, aware that her role in these revelations could still get her fired. "Uncle David told me how you helped him," Tommy said, his eyes bright with tears and gratitude. "How you told him about me and how you found his letters. You saved me twice." David looked at Rosa with profound gratitude. "I can never repay what you've done for our family." Richard, perhaps realizing that firing Rosa would create yet another family crisis, simply nodded stiffly. Rosa has always been thorough in her work. 6 months later, Rosa's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She was now the official head of household staff, with a salary that allowed her to move to a better apartment and help support her own family back home. More importantly, she watched every day as Tommy blossomed under his uncle's attention and love. David had moved to an apartment just 10 minutes away and saw Tommy almost every day after school. The boy who had once spent his afternoons alone now had someone to help with homework, someone to talk to about his dreams and fears, someone who understood his sensitive nature and encouraged it rather than trying to change it. Richard and Victoria's marriage was undergoing its own transformation. The revelation about the intercepted letters had forced them to confront their failures as parents, and while the process was painful, both were making efforts to be more present in Tommy's life. But the biggest change was in Tommy himself. The lonely, anxious boy had been replaced by a confident young man who knew he was loved. He still read books about space and drew pictures of rockets, but now he shared these interests with an uncle who found them fascinating. He still got good grades, but now he brought them home to someone who celebrated his intelligence rather than taking it for granted. As Rosa watched Tommy and David work on a science project at the kitchen table one evening, both of them completely absorbed in building a model of the solar system, she reflected on how sometimes being a hero means simply caring enough to tell the truth. She had jumped into a pool to save Tommy's life, but the real rescue had been helping him find the family love that had been there all along, just hidden behind walls of lies and jealousy. Tommy looked up from their project and smiled at her, the same bright smile she had first seen when he talked about black holes and galaxies. But now it was a smile that belonged to a boy who knew he was valued, protected, and deeply loved. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who refuse to let love stay hidden in the shadows.